The Vatican, October 30th, 1503. You're standing in the Apostolic Palace beneath ceilings that stretch toward heaven itself, frescoes of angels and saints painted in eternal watchfulness. Their eyes, for the first time in centuries, seem to look away, not in pity, but in silent acknowledgement of what is about to unfold. The air is thick, heavy with incense, with candle smoke, with wine, and with something else, something physical, like a stone lodged deep in your chest. 50 women crawl across the marble floors, naked, trembling. Not in some forgotten corner of Rome's underbelly. Not in a pagan temple buried by time. But here, in the very heart of Christendom, in the home of the man who claims to speak for God, his vicar on earth. Their knees scrape against cold stone, skin raw, breath shallow, voices caught somewhere between whimper and scream. Cardinals line the walls in scarlet robes that catch the candlelight like pools of blood. Some cross themselves so frantically their hands blur. Others turn away, but their feet remain rooted because the doors are locked. Guards stand at every archway, swords sheathed but hands resting on hilts. No one moves. No one speaks. At the center of it all, elevated on a throne gilded in gold that glows like molten sin, sits Pope Alexander VI, the Holy Father, God's representative on earth. He smiles, leans forward as if enjoying a theater performance, laughs at a whispered joke, makes a bet with the man beside him, his son Cesare Borgia, whose face is cold marble, betraying nothing. But this is only the opening act. What follows will be so depraved, so opposed to every sacred word ever spoken within these walls, that Yen Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies, will sit in his chamber afterward with trembling hands, knowing that what he is about to write might be the most damning testimony ever penned against the Church. This is the story of a wedding night that became a nightmare. A night when 2 innocent people were sacrificed to satisfy the twisted appetites of the most powerful family in Italy. A night when the Vatican itself became a theater of hell. And the question is not how it happened, but who was forced to suffer, and why did everyone stand there and watch? Her name was Lucrezia Borgia. By 1503, her name alone was enough to make noblemen cross themselves in fear or disgust. Poisoner, seductress, schemer, the whisper of her name traveled across Europe like a curse. Yet those who actually knew her, the attendants who dressed her in the morning, the servants who watched her sleep, the quiet companions who walked the palace halls, knew something different. They saw a 21-year-old woman with eyes far older than her face, a woman who woke screaming, clawing at her chest, haunted by horrors she refused to name. She was not the monster history paints. She was prey. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, fled Rome in the dead of night, claiming assassins pursued him. He wasn't paranoid. He was lucky. The marriage had been annulled the moment it ceased serving her father's ambitions. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was not so fortunate. He was 19 and in love, believing in a shared future, in the possibility that Lucrezia could be more than a pawn. He died violently, strangled on the steps of the Vatican, with assassins making sure she heard his final screams echoing through the corridors. Love, they understood, was a weakness the Borgias could not afford. And now, autumn of 1503 brought another announcement that made all of Italy hold its breath. Lucrezia Borgia would marry again. This time, the groom was Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara, a young prince raised on ideals of honor, duty, and the weight of lineage. He tried to refuse, sending envoys with carefully worded excuses, begging his father for alternatives, offering bribes, trade agreements, military support, anything to avoid this marriage. But you do not say no to Alexander VI. The message arrived in Ferrara quietly, but each word struck like a blade. Accept this marriage, or your family will be erased from history. It was not hyperbole. Cesari's armies could obliterate Ferrara within weeks. Excommunication would strip the d'Este family of legitimacy. Allies would become enemies overnight, and centuries of influence could vanish in a single season. Alfonso packed his belongings, kissed his mother goodbye, and rode toward Rome like a condemned man walking to the gallows, unaware that the real gallows was not steel or fire, but ritual, spectacle, and fear. Because this wedding was not about politics. It was not about alliances, trade, or military strategy. It was about breaking 2 people. It was a demonstration to all of Italy of the absolute power of the Borgias. Every noble family, every potential rival, every whispered threat would be reminded that resistance carried consequences. Death, disgrace, or humiliation. The ceremony itself was no sanctuary. The Apostolic Palace, the seat of Christendom, became a theater of cruelty. Candles burned low, their wax dripping onto the marble like frozen tears. Servants and courtiers moved through the halls like ghosts, complicit in their silence. Even the priests, supposed mediators between the sacred and the human, played roles in a ritual designed not to bless, but to assert dominion. Lucrezia, dressed in silks that suffocated as much as they adorned, moved like a puppet, her strings pulled by threats she could neither see nor escape. The corridors echoed with the whisper of cardinals, with hushed steps of the armed, with the clatter of noble feet. Every step toward the altar was a step deeper into her own subjugation. Alfonso, forced by threat and obligation, mirrored her steps, equally trapped, equally powerless. Love and consent dissolved in the face of dynastic ambition. And the night that followed? History largely erases it. Official accounts sanitize it with claims of political necessity, divine will, and noble duty. But private letters, servants' memoirs, and whispered testimonies reveal something far more human: terror, humiliation, and a calculated stripping away of will. The wedding night was less a consummation of love than a consummation of power, the Borgia family demonstrating, in the starkest possible terms, what could happen to anyone who defied them. Lucrezia would survive, adapt, and even wield influence in her own right in later years. But in that moment, she was a symbol, a reminder that institutions, religious, political, dynastic, could and would weaponize ritual, tradition, and ceremony against the vulnerable. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, complicity, and the human cost of ambition. Stories of saints and heroes stretching along every wall. The frescoes glowed in the candlelight, but their glory could not mask the tension that hung in every corridor like smoke. Servants moved silently, carrying trays of wine and silverware, their faces pale, eyes flicking toward doors they dared not open. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. Every footstep echoed like a drumbeat in the hearts of those trapped within the Vatican's walls. Lucrezia sat in her chambers, the silk of her gown sticking to her skin, her fingers trembling as she touched the intricate embroidery. Every pearl in her braids seemed to weigh her down, each a tiny chain binding her to the night that awaited. She did not see herself as a bride. She saw herself as an offering, a pawn on a chessboard too vast and merciless for any mortal to understand. Outside, Alfonso paced, forced into a gilded cage, each step measured, each breath a reminder of the chains around him. He had been a man raised to command, to defend, to strategize, and yet here, power meant nothing. It was stripped from him before the ceremony even began, a humiliating lesson delivered with precision and cruelty. The appointed hour came. Bells rang across Rome, echoing from the 7 hills, summoning the faithful to witness what was presented as a papal wedding. Crowds gathered in the streets, unaware of the horrors meticulously orchestrated within the palace. Inside, Lucrezia was led to the chapel by her attendants. Her footsteps were soft, hesitant, muffled by the carpets, each one dragging her closer to a fate she could neither resist nor fully comprehend. The chapel itself seemed impossibly large, every surface gilded, every painting a story of virtue and divine purpose, yet none of it offered comfort. Alexander VI presided over the ceremony personally, his booming voice filling the chamber as he bound Alonso and Lucrezia together before God. His words were meant to sanctify, to provide divine approval, but beneath the surface of ritual, there was dominance, calculation, and terror. The cardinals lining the walls remained statuesque, faces carved into masks of devotion, yet their eyes betrayed unease, a recognition of the unnatural theater unfolding before them. Outside the chapel doors, a hidden chamber awaited the 50 women who had been brought through secret passages. They were to participate in the ceremony in ways they could neither predict nor refuse. Silk gowns, velvet cloaks, polished shoes, they were dressed for honor, yet stripped of agency. The rituals that followed blurred the line between celebration and punishment. Every movement, every gesture, every gaze reinforced the hierarchy. Alexander and Cesare were untouchable. Lucrezia and Alfonso were instruments. The attendants, the witnesses, even the clergy were complicit, each caught in their own fear and obedience. The corridor outside Lucrezia's chamber echoed with hushed whispers, faint prayers, and the occasional shuddering sob. Servants crossed themselves so many times their hands cramped. Some whispered to statues of saints, hoping for divine intervention that would never come. When Lucrezia finally walked toward the central altar, the weight of history pressed down upon her. The frescoed ceilings seemed to bend, the saints above gazing silently at the unfolding spectacle. She took her place beside Alfonso, whose posture was stiff, every muscle taut with a mixture of fear, indignation, and resignation. The vows were exchanged, words that carried a veneer of holiness masking the coercion that underscored every syllable. Every I do was spoken under threat, every promise measured by survival, not devotion. After the ceremony, guests were escorted to the bordering apartments, halls resplendent with frescoes by Pinturicchio. Stories of saints and heroes stretched along every wall, but they were hollow reminders of virtue, echoing against a reality dominated by manipulation and terror. Banquets followed, laughter mingling uneasily with whispered dread. Alexander joked about Lucrezia's past husbands, the cardinals chuckling nervously, glancing at each other as if to confirm the absurdity and cruelty of it all. Alfonso remained frozen, a figure of silent endurance, while Lucrezia's eyes betrayed her inner desolation. Preparations for the night were as meticulous as they were terrifying. The 50 women were arranged in hidden chambers, kept apart, escorted through narrow passages lit only by lanterns. Their silks and velvets, once symbols of elegance, became instruments of exposure, stripping away dignity piece by piece. No one dared resist the Pope's instructions. No one spoke a word of protest. The ritual was total, absolute, a display of power orchestrated with surgical precision. And in the Master of Ceremonies chamber, Johann Burchard trembled as he read over the final protocols. His quill hovered, shaking over the parchment, knowing that each word he documented could become either buried evidence or eternal testimony of corruption. The night descended slowly over Rome, yet in the Vatican, time felt suspended. Every moment was deliberate, orchestrated to heighten fear, obedience, and humiliation. And as Lucrezia prepared herself, kneeling alone for a final moment before the ceremonial transition, she realized the truth she could not escape. There would be no rescue, no miracle, no reprieve. The power wielded against her and Alfonso was absolute. Their fate, their bodies, their dignity, all were instruments of demonstration, tools of control displayed for all to see, hidden behind the sanctity of tradition and the veneer of religion. By the time the night reached its climax, Lucrezia and Alfonso were no longer merely bride and groom. They had become symbols, warnings to all Italy about the consequences of defiance, the reach of the Borgias, and the terrifying intersection of ambition, ritual, and absolute authority. Then Cesare, silent until now, slowly rose from his seat. With the tilt of his head, a subtle but unmistakable command was given. The massive doors slammed shut, reverberating like cannon fire. Guards took positions, hands on sword hilts, faces grim. No one would leave. Side doors opened, and 50 women stepped into the hall, draped in velvet and jewels, their eyes wide with terror. A hush fell, thick as smoke. Alexander VI rose, smiling as if unveiling a masterpiece. "My friends," he announced, his voice ringing through the vaulted chamber, "the true entertainment is about to begin." The courtesans began to disrobe at his command. Silk and velvet fell to the marble floors until they stood entirely naked before the assembly. Princes, cardinals, and nobles froze in stunned disbelief. The cathedral, a place consecrated for prayer, now hosted a scene ripped from a blasphemous dream. Cardinals turned away, trembling, fingers tracing crosses. Some attempted to rise, but guards shifted forward, an unspoken threat halting any attempt at escape. Alfonso sat frozen, drained of color, as Lucrezia began to cry silently. Tears soaked her wedding gown, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles whitened. But Alexander was just getting started. He ordered baskets of chestnuts brought in, scattered across the marble floor. They rolled between horrified guests like small, cruel thunderclaps. And then the command that made even seasoned nobles flinch. The naked courtesans were to crawl on all fours between the legs of cardinals and princes to collect the chestnuts. The woman who gathered the most would be rewarded with golden silks. What followed defied belief. 50 naked women crawled across the sacred Vatican floor, weaving between the robes of church princes as Alexander and Cesare watched from above, laughing and placing bets as if in a cheap brothel. Some young cardinals, drunk and overwhelmed, joined in the laughter. Others bowed their heads, crushed by the collision of faith and terror. Alfonso remained motionless, unable to comprehend that this was his wedding feast, unfolding under the eyes of the man who claimed to speak for God. Lucrezia's wedding dress, now soaked and torn, had become a shroud. Her tears dried into frozen emptiness. Her wedding had become a ritual of damnation. The Vatican clocks tolled midnight. Alexander raised his hand, silencing the room. The chestnut game ended. Exhausted courtesans huddled in corners. Wine spilled across tables. Guests sat paralyzed, half drunk, half stunned, entirely broken. But Alexander's mind remained clear. His next command descended on the hall like a blade. The sacred duty of marriage must now be fulfilled. The horror escalated. Alfonso d'Este was ordered to consummate the marriage with Lucrezia, not once, but 3 times, and not in privacy. Every witness present was to remain, verifying the union before the church and the world. The hall fell into shocked silence. Even Cesare looked sharply at his father, caught off guard by the audacity. Alfonso rose slowly, face gray as ash, surrounded by armed men whose hands rested on sword hilts. There was no choice. He extended his hand to Lucrezia. Her fingers, cold as death, slid into his. Together they walked toward an adjoining chamber, a bed, candles, fresh linens, a bridal chamber. But the doors remained wide open. There was no privacy, no humanity. The assembled witnesses, unable to leave, stared silently as the act commenced. This was not a union. It was the deliberate destruction of 2 human beings. Prayers whispered, tears shed, horror etched into every face. Even the courtesans, who had survived the chestnut ordeal, looked away in grief. As the night dragged on, the Pope's commands enforced every step of domination, humiliation, and ritualized control. And in that moment, a single truth became undeniable. Something sacred had died within the Vatican. The walls that once bore witness to faith, hope, and devotion now held the echoes of cruelty, terror, and human suffering. Alfonso and Lucrezia's lives, their dignity, their autonomy, had been stripped away in a single, orchestrated night of horror. If you've stayed with this account, if you feel the weight of what happened, then you understand the lesson. Human dignity is fragile. When power goes unchecked, it corrupts, consumes, and reshapes the sacred into instruments of domination. The Vatican, in October 1503, became a theater of terror, a reminder that history often hides its darkest truths behind ceremony, pageantry, and the veneer of tradition. Remember it. The past isn't something locked in dusty books. It breathes through the silence of witnesses, through the corridors of power, through the shadows of marble halls where the voices of the powerless were erased. That night, restraint was non-existent, and humanity was forgotten. But this was not fiction. This was reality, in the heart of Christendom, under the roof of the man who claimed to speak for God on earth, and almost everyone present stayed silent. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows of the Borger apartments, Lucrezia had slipped into a state beyond exhaustion, beyond fear. Her mind, desperate to survive, had separated itself from the nightmare unfolding around her. She moved mechanically, without thought, as if her spirit had fled her body to escape the horror. She could no longer fight. When the ordeal was finally completed, Cesare announced triumphantly that the marriage was now bound, 3 times, sealed in the eyes of both church and law. Impossible to challenge, impossible to undo. Alexander VI raised his wine cup in satisfaction, smiling as if the night had been nothing more than an extravagant celebration. What remained were the broken cardinals. They had entered draped in scarlet as servants of God, but now they stood as unwilling witnesses to an atrocity they could never confess. Their silence, their inaction, had made them accomplices. When the sun rose fully over Rome, it revealed devastation. Empty wine jugs, chestnuts crushed into the marble floor, exhausted courtesans curled in corners, guards standing like statues, eyes downcast. In the adjoining chamber, Lucrezia lay completely still, staring upward as if the ceiling were miles away. Her body remained in the room, but her spirit had retreated somewhere unreachable. Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, trembling violently, face buried in his hands. Nothing in his life, no battlefield, no political threat, had ever shattered him like this night. Within days, Alfonso left Rome quietly, broken beyond repair. He returned to Ferrara carrying a silence he would hold for the rest of his life. Not once would he ever speak of that night again. But the story could not be contained. Word of the banquet spread like a plague whisper across the streets of Rome, becoming murmurs throughout Italy, eventually reaching courts across Europe. Ambassadors wrote in coded letters. Priests spoke in veiled warnings. Nobles read dispatches in stunned disbelief. The Venetian envoy famously wrote, "What happened in the Vatican surpasses even the darkest imaginations of ancient Rome." The Borgias had been feared before, but now they were viewed as the very embodiment of corruption. In marketplaces and taverns, people lowered their voices when uttering the family name, as if the family itself could hear. Lucrezia moved to Ferrara and tried desperately to craft a normal life. She funded charities, protected artists, nurtured literature and beauty. But privately, those who observed her described the same thing: a lingering sorrow, a quiet melancholy, eyes that had seen too much. She bore children with Alfonso, but their marriage, irreparably poisoned by that night, remained a hollow shell. They lived side by side, separated by a wound no human could mend. Lucrezia died young, at 39, giving birth to her 8th child. On her deathbed, she asked for a priest and prayed until her final breath. Her last recorded words were, "I am ready to be free at last." Freedom, something she had been denied her entire life. Alexander VI died only months after the banquet. Rumors whispered that poison, the tool he had wielded so often, finally found its way back to him. Cesare, stripped of power after his father's death, fell into a lonely ambush in Spain, his body mutilated and cast into an unmarked grave, far from the grandeur he had imagined for himself. But the night of October 30th, 1503, did not die with them. That night became a symbol, an icon of corruption so severe it fueled the flames of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and others invoked the Borgias repeatedly as proof of the Vatican's decay. The Counter-Reformation that followed was in part an attempt to erase the stain of this family from history. Yet the truth survived. Centuries later, Johann Broussard's diary resurfaced, dragging the event back into the light and refusing to let it be forgotten. Even today, more than 500 years later, the chestnut banquet and the triple shame stand as infamous reminders of what happens when absolute power loses all restraint. But here is what haunts most. It's not just that it happened. It's that almost everyone in the room, cardinals, nobles, witnesses, stayed. They watched. They remained silent. They became accomplices through their inaction. Speaking up would have meant risking everything: their positions, their lives, their families. And so they chose their own safety over the dignity of 2 human beings being destroyed before them. This is not merely history. This is a mirror. It warns us that humanity's darkest acts are often committed in the places meant to be most sacred. Evil thrives not only through the actions of monsters, but also through the silence of witnesses. Edmund Burke once wrote, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." On that night in 1503, in the heart of the Vatican, good men did nothing, and 2 innocent people paid the price. You've just witnessed one of history's darkest truths. Stories like this remind us how fragile humanity is, how easily dignity can be crushed when power loses its conscience. If you feel that weight, subscribe to Crimson Historians. Help us keep digging into the archives. Help us uncover accounts that powerful institutions spent centuries trying to bury. Because the past isn't dead. It watches. It warns. And it's up to us to remember, to bear witness, and to never allow silence to condone cruelty again.